Good morning, everybody. Just signing on to the FT website. And what do we have? Coronavirus. US posts record number of daily COVID cases, COVID-19. Figures passes 57,000 as Trump pushes ahead with fireworks display for July 4th weekend. So that's 57,000 daily COVID cases. Oh my God, that's going around. UK in talks to join EU coronavirus vaccine plan. Of course, the vaccine bubbling away in the background. Republican resistance squads launch anti-Trump barrage. What are they going to do? Do they want Joe Biden to become the president, or do they really think they can get another candidate instead of the president? Portugal blasts absurd England quarantine measures. Snub branded a sad moment in relations between the two countries, because there's these things called air bridges, but I guess they haven't mentioned it there, so maybe it doesn't apply to Portugal. Now here's the big one, the big read. PWC KPMG EY Deloitte. After Wirecard, is it time to audit the auditors? So Wirecard was a German fintech firm. I think they were involved in payments somewhere along the line. So whenever you pay for something, they were doing something in the background, in the plumbing. And it turned out that they had a couple of billion on their balance sheet that wasn't really, well, it didn't exist. They said it was in the Philippines, but apparently it didn't exist. So then, every so often, when you have these types of huge crashes where a company just disappears, a massive company suddenly just disappears, then people say, well, we need to ask questions. How did that happen? Who are the accountants? Why was it that all that money suddenly just disappeared? It was there and it was gone. Or did it just disappear, or was it never there in the first place? And if it was never there, how come nobody noticed? Jonathan Ford and Tabby Kinder. I think Tabby Kinder's pretty good. At the end of 2003, the Italian dairy company Parmalat descended into bankruptcy in an eye-catchingly abrupt manner. A routine bank reconciliation revealed that 3.9 billion euros of cash, which Parmalat was supposed to have at Bank of America, did not actually exist. The scam that emerged duly blew apart one of Italian's best-known entrepreneurial companies and sent its founder, Callisto Tanzi, to prison for fraud. Dubbed Europe's Enron, it humiliated two large auditing firms, Deloitte and Grant Thornton, and ended up costing the former $149 million in damages. Yet it rested on an apparently simple deception. The reconciliation letter on which the auditors were relying had been forged. There were shades of Parmalat's collapse again last week when, nearly 2 decades later, another fast-growing European entrepreneurial company blew up in strikingly similar circumstances. After years of public questions about the reliability of its accounts, primarily from the FT, the German electronic payments giant Wirecard was forced to admit to a massive hole in its balance sheet. Rattled by the failure of an independent probe by KPMG to verify transactions underpinning the lion's share of its reported profits between 2016 and 2018, and unable to publish its results due to issues eventually raised by its long-standing auditors Ernst & Young, EY, Wirecard finally capitulated. It announced that purported 1.9 billion euros cash balances at its banks in the Philippines probably did not exist, and parted company with its chief executive Marcus Brown. Evidence relied on by EY had been bogus. And then you have a photo of the Parmalat guy being carted off to jail. It remains unclear exactly how the crucial information slipped through the cracks. According to one EY partner, the general view internally is that confirming historic cash balances is auditing 101, and that ordinary auditing processes were followed, including third-party verification, in which case the fraud was sophisticated in its use of false documents. Others, however, take a less charitable view of such slip-ups, especially when, as with both Wirecard and Parmalat, they were preceded by so many questions about the reliability of the figures. The integrity of the cash account, which records cash and should reconcile to all the other items in the accounts, is totally central to the whole system of double-entry bookkeeping, says Kartik Ramana, Professor of Business and Public Policy at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government. If there is no integrity to the cash amount, then the whole system is just a joke. Shareholder support. Wirecard's collapse is the latest in a wave of accounting scandals that has swept through the corporate world, including UK outsourcing group Carillion, an Abu Dhabi-based hospital group NMC Health, as well as alleged frauds at the mini-bond firm London Capital and Finance, and the cafe chain Patisserie Valerie. Many fear a further surge as the COVID-19 lockdown washes away those companies with weakened balance sheets or business models in the coming months. Questions about softball auditing have dogged many recent high-profile insolvencies. Carillion's enthusiasm for buying companies with few tangible assets for high prices led it to build up £1.5 billion of goodwill on its balance sheet. Despite vast losses at some of those subsidiaries, it had written down the value of just £134 million of that goodwill when the whole edifice caved in. Similar questions hang over LCF, where close reading of the notes in the last accounts it published show how the estimated fair value of its liabilities far exceeded those of its assets in 2017, making it technically insolvent roughly 18 months before it collapsed, taking with it more than £200 million of savers' cash. Yet EY gave the accounts a clean bill of health. Such cases have raised concerns about the independence of auditors and their willingness to challenge the wishes of management at the client, who are often driven by their own desire for self-enrichment or survival. It's so important, if you want to keep the relationship, to have a rapport with the finance director, said a financier who once worked at a Big Four auditing firm. It's basically sometimes easier to swallow what you're told. It's a problem that's deepened with the adoption of modern accounting standards. Over the past 3 decades, these have progressively dismantled the traditional system of historical cost accounting, with its emphasis on the verifiability of evidence and use of prudent judgment, replacing it with one based on the idea that the primary purpose of the accounts is to present information that is useful to users. The process has allowed managers to pull forward anticipated profits and unrealized gains and write them up as today's surpluses. Many company bonus schemes depend on the delivery of the right accounting numbers. In theory, shareholders are supposed to provide a check on the influence of self-interested bosses. They choose the auditors and they set the terms of the engagement. But in practice, investors tend not to assert themselves in the relationship. Scandals rarely lead to the ejection of auditors. So after UK telecoms group BT announced a £530 million write-down in 2017 because of accounting misstatements at its Italian business, the auditors PWC were not sanctioned by investors. Far from it, the firm was reappointed with more than 75% support. And when EY came up for re-election at Wirecard in the summer of 2018, despite rumblings about the numbers, it was voted back by more than 99%. Tight budgets and timetables. It's not only an auditor's desire for an easy life that can drain audits of that all-important culture of challenge. There are practical issues too. Tight budgets and timetables limit the scope for investigation. Audit fees in Europe are far below those in the US. Audits of Russell 3000 index companies in the US cost 0.39% of company turnover on average. Those in Europe average just 0.13%, while for German companies it's a feeble 0.09%. With fees low, auditing firms are often stretched thin, with only limited support from a partner out of a desire to limit costs and maximize the number of audits done. Audit is traditionally the junior partner in a big accountancy firm, with around 4/5 of the Big Four's profits coming from the non-audit consultancy side. Oh look, you can see in dark blue it's auditing, and then in light blue it's other. PwC making loads of money from other stuff. God knows what they're advising on. Take the last audit of BHS under the ownership of Philip Green, who sold the failing UK retailer to little-known entrepreneur Dominic Chappell in 2015. The chain subsequently collapsed the following year. The PwC partner, Steve Dennison, recorded only 2 hours of work auditing the financial statement. The number 2, an auditor with just 1 year's post-qualification experience, recorded 29.25 hours, and the more junior team members 114 hours. Mr. Dennison was later fined for misconduct and effectively banned by the audit regulator. According to Tim Bush, head of governance and financial analysis at the Pensions and Investment Research Consultants, a shareholder advisory group, this reliance on juniors tends to result in box checking rather than investigative approach to audit processes. Audit firms are less likely to have a feel for the company's business model, he says. This in turn can open the door to abuse. Scams often hinge on faith in some implausible business activity. Parmalat's €3.9 billion cash pile, for instance, was supposed to have come from selling milk powder to Cuba, but an analysis of the volumes suggested that if the company's numbers were accurate, each of the island's inhabitants would have to be consuming 60 gallons a year. As the author Richard Brooks noted in his book Bean Counters, it shouldn't have been difficult for a half-competent audit firm to spot. No golden age. The academic Prem Seeker rejects the idea that auditing has gone downhill in the past few decades. Go back into history and you'll find there was never a golden age, he says. He argues that most of the weaknesses are of long-standing vintage and are down to a lack of accountability. On the audit side, there's no transparency. You have no idea as a reader of accounts how much time the auditor spent on the task and whether that was reasonable, said the Professor of Accounting at the University of Sheffield. While there are signs that the UK regulator is getting tougher, it's down to shareholders to provide stronger evidence. Professor Seeker says, if they won't do it, the government should consider setting up a state agency to commission audits of firms and set fees. It wouldn't have to be everyone. You could just do large companies and banks. Britain has recently been through a comprehensive review of audit, including how it is regulated and competition in the market, plus a review by the businessman Donald Brydon of its purpose. This devoted many pages to establishing it as a distinct new profession and coming up with new statements to include in already groaning company reports. Far from creating new tasks, many observers think that audit should reconnect with its original purpose. This is to assure investors that companies' capital is not being abused by over-optimistic or fraudulent managers. At their heart, audits are about protecting capital and thereby ensuring responsible stewardship of capital, says Natasha Landell-Mills, head of stewardship at the asset manager Saracen and Partners. Yet modern accounting practice has made audits more complicated while watering down the legal requirement to exercise the judgment needed to ensure the numbers are true and fair. Despite the endless mushrooming of numbers, it's no easier to know if the capital is really present and can thus justify the payment of dividends and bonuses. Michael Isser, Chief Executive of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, says auditors need a renewed focus on internal controls, going concern and fraud. The vast majority of business failures are not the fault of the auditor, but when audit quality is a contributory factor, the problem generally involves these three fundamental areas. Mr. Bush thinks a radical simplification is in order. Without clarity, there is never going to be proper accountability, he says. What we have is a recipe for weak auditing and ever more wildcards and parmalats. In the extreme, it facilitates Ponzi schemes. Stay on that route, and it won't be long before you come unstuck. Well, that's very interesting. Let's have a quick look at the comments. Dun, 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 dun. Where are they? Yeah, I think comments will be coming on this one because you don't have a big read without comments. Yes, so who audits the auditors? Who regulates the regulators? Who regulates the regulators? Who tracks the trackers? Who guards the guards? Who polices the police? You know, these are the normal. It's infinite regression, turtles all the way down. But at some point you've got to stop. And I think this is what Gödel says, a system can't be defined by itself. And there are more numbers between 0 and 1 than there are integers between 0 and infinity. There's infinite detail in between all of these things. And, you know, there's just rabbit holes. You could get lost inside all of this stuff. But let's have a look at some of the comments. How many are there? 132. It does need to have proper government intervention auditing at large companies and banks. This is market failure. Incentives to do it right are not there. Disparities in costs between US and EU is ridiculous. Looked at from the client perspective, lying to a complicit partner taking your coin is one thing. Lying to the government is quite another. You can't change the skewed incentives in the model unless you work things out from the basis of incentives. Nothing will change until that changes. Yeah. And you've got this whole thing, because this is the politics of information, isn't it? So you've got this whole idea of blowing the whistle, of calling it out, and the person who calls it out, you know, should they be rewarded? Because the thing is, at this point, technically they're just doing their job, but we've got to the point where none of them are doing their job. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because if the whole industry doesn't do its job, then suddenly we can say, oh, we'll give lots of money to someone who does do their job. It's completely sort of wrong-headed, and everything's working in reverse. But yeah, let's have a look at this one. We have read in this paper for the last 3 years that the Big Four, PWC, EY, Deloitte and KPMG are not fit for purpose. They're just white-collar crooks. And why haven't they been broken up like Anderson, who audited Enron, Wellcome, Tyco? And here we are. I mean, it wasn't long ago they were talking about the breakup of the Big Four. You know, oh yeah, the breakup of the Big Four, but it doesn't happen. You know, and, you know, they say it again and again and again, and you can see it's not going to happen. They've been around for so long. Why would they suddenly disappear? They're just not going to happen. All of these different problems, and it's all, a lot of it is coming from here in the UK, isn't it? It's the UK that creates these firms. Okay, so let's have a bit of a pause.